Hello, and this is a presentation on chapters related to North America. The North American continent is much larger than the North American region. The North American continent extends from all the way up in Alaska and Canada to as far to the southern borders of Panama. So that includes Mexico, Central America, and all the Caribbean islands. But the region of North America, which is the only region in our chapters that only has a couple of countries. Most of the regions in all of our chapters have multiple countries. In this particular case, North America is pretty much defined by the similarities that Canada and the United States share in terms of its overall development. Both started out as British colonies, and both sort of progressed in size over the 19th century through a series of deals and partnerships and treaties that simply divided the territories up into different segments. The United States is a little more complicated than Canada, but partly that has to do with the difference in physical geography. Canada has vast sections that are quite remote, whereas the United States is fairly well populated all the way across particularly the continental parts of the United States. In terms of size, Canada is the second largest country in the world physically. The United States is the fourth largest. So together, they even though it's only two countries, they represent a very large segment of the world's land-based geography. Canada and the United States are very well linked together, both economically, culturally, and socially. Canada and the United States are each other's largest trading partners. Of course, we share the same common language, though Canada is a bilingual country. It has technically two national languages, French and English, but the majority of the population in Canada speaks English. Also, in terms of population, the majority of Canada's population falls right along the United States border, and so that also creates a close link or tie to the two countries. This gives you a little bit of information about their overall geographic size. As you can see, Canada is actually not that much bigger than the United States, but that is primarily because of Alaska. The continental United States is only about half the size of the overall territory of Canada. The population, though, is where you see a dramatic change. The population of the United States is about 350 million, whereas in Canada it's about 35 million, so dramatic difference. And in terms of breakdown of demographics, both are very similar. While they sort of list here that the white population is about 83%, keep in mind that doesn't include the Hispanic population, which is the largest minority in the United States, coming in close to around 20%. But some Latinos also will fall into the white considered to be white in terms of racial background. In Canada, you'll notice it talks about British origin, French origin, other European origins. Pretty much that would constitute the white, quote-unquote, white population. The other thing to keep in mind that's not represented here is that Canada has a very large Asian population, representing about 2% of the population, mostly in urban areas like Vancouver and Toronto. The physical geography of this region does vary dramatically, although most of it is mountainous and plains, temperate climate. There is, the far reaches, is polar and quite dry and arid in the tundra regions of the northern parts of Canada and Alaska. It is tropical in the southern parts of the United States, specifically down the lower parts of Florida, the tips of Texas. The Great Lakes region and major rivers also create huge inland links for this particular region in ways that other regions don't have those kind of interior links through man-made canals and other waterways. Both Canada and the United States are very well linked through water traffic, shipping traffic, all the way into the interior parts of the country. But certainly both have very extensive rail systems and highway systems that link other areas that are not brought together by water. This little map kind of gives you a kind of a breakdown of the climatic regions of Canada and the United States, and you can see there's a lot of similarities across the region. This map relates to land usage. You'll notice that the areas up through here that are kind of a teal green color correspond to forest and lumbering industries. You actually have lumbering industries down here in the United States. The difference is this is undeveloped territory that is primarily used for the extraction of natural resources, mostly lumber, but also particularly in this section right here and places like Alberta and Saskatchewan, you have the thriving oil industry in Canada. Down here in the lower United States, over time, this territory has been carved up into farms and ranches, as well as continuing to serve as mining and lumber and so forth. And so, even though it looks like there's a lot of different uses in this area, there's a lot of similarities in the way this territory is used out west in particular, but even in the far northern regions, sharing a lot in common with the western regions. It's down here where you have more of the urbanized areas. Even in Canada, the primary urban sections are right along through here. There is a lot of mixed forest throughout this particular region. Certainly a lot of evergreens, which is where most of the lumber industry focuses on today. Paper mills and other kinds of paper products or wood-based products are primarily thrive through the extraction of evergreen trees. But then, in particular with Canada, there is a thriving lumber industry dedicated to the building industry. In other words, lumber for structures. And most of the lumber for houses built here in the United States actually comes down from Canada. And in that regard, there's both pine, which is used in lumber, as well as other products that use hardwoods or sections of hardwood in order to be sort of create strength within the lumber product. Again, something that is very common in Canada, but we certainly do produce here in the United States. This particular region does see its share of natural hazards, hurricanes, predominantly off the East Coast, moving up through the Caribbean and the Gulf of Mexico, but then also along the Gulf Coast, the East Coast. And then you see, of course, tornadoes are very prevalent throughout the central part of the United States and even the southern central part of Canada. The United States actually experiences more tornadoes than other areas in the world, and that has a lot to do with the location of plains alongside mountain ranges. While hurricanes, we have sort of our share, there are other regions that are more devastated by hurricanes, such as the South Pacific. The other thing that makes this area, unique in terms of natural hazards is that we do have quite a few earthquakes over and above local earthquakes here in Oklahoma. there is a line of faults and volcanoes extending from Alaska all the way down through Canada, through the Cascades, in other words, Oregon, Washington State, California, and then continues all the way down the coast into Central America and South America. And so that creates its own kind of unique kinds of weather conditions, hazard conditions. Floods, we have regular floods throughout this region, although the thing that has really created a unique perspective is, most of the farming that we see in North America originates from or originated a century ago, a couple of centuries ago even, from farming practices learned for over 1,000 years in Europe. The difference is in Europe, while there's similar climate, Europe doesn't deal with drought the way that North America does. Europe, because of its coastal connections, regularly gets rain, snowfall, and so the land, while it is overpacked with population and large farms aren't allowed to, there really isn't room for large farming operations to thrive. In North America, to add, while there is room to do vast, large-scale farming, there are periods of time when drought does make it difficult to farm, and so that creates its own challenges. The Dust Bowl is sort of the big famous example from the 1930s when this part of the United States, Oklahoma, Kansas, Texas, and even western Colorado experience tremendous drought, and as a result, huge winds would create, almost thunderstorm-like conditions, only without the rain, just blowing dust. So there's a similar cultural history in the region. You see, British and French settlers, even Spanish settlers, coming into this region for a few hundred years up until the time of the Revolution. Canada never experienced the dramatic revolution that the United States, of course, did. Canada continued to be part of the British Empire into the 20th century, but in terms of settlement, in terms of immigration into the United States, is very similar to what we see also occurring in Canada. People coming here for natural resources, people coming here for free land from all across Europe, as well as parts of Asia, particularly Chinese and Japanese populations. You also have similar traditions with the Native American population. Large, vast Native American populations, many of which treated much the same way here in the United States as well as in Canada, in terms of segregation, forced them to move from nomadic lifestyles in some cases to farming, moving them into reservations or into segregated land holdings, so that privatization of land could take place around native property. European settlers, of course, famously have brought disease, which, starting with Columbus, killed off about 25% of the Native American population. When we talk about Europe being sort of hit by the quote-unquote Black Plague during the Middle Ages, imagine, people who are resistant to the plague now showing up in the Western Hemisphere and bringing all those diseases with them, killing off a population that wasn't familiar with those same elements. Horses, though, underrated in terms of their influence on the dynamics of North America. Horses are indigenous to Asia and Europe, brought in by European settlers, and became very popular among Native American populations over centuries, starting in the 18th century and certainly moving into the 19th century. We see the iconic Indian on horseback is not the traditional Native American was not traditional to Native Americans until after European settlement. But of course, horses had played a huge role in helping to settle the United States, as well as expand the terrain and the regions of different Native American tribes, particularly nomadic tribes like the Comanche and the Kiowa. This gives you a little bit of map of how the United States in particular was settled. It's a patchwork of different territories, either acquired by treaty or purchase, or through war, primarily war with Mexico. Certainly Texas, the Texas and Mexican War opened up that territory down there, and eventually the United States just simply annexed it. The Mexican wars later on in the century helped open up California and southern parts of Arizona, and then eventually, purchasing, of course, land from France and from Spain and Florida opened up that property. Excuse me. This gives you a little bit of the patchwork for Canada. Canadian territory was only in dispute at one point, and that was during the French and Indian War. So the war prior to the Revolutionary War, where essentially the French lost control of Quebec. Many people from Quebec, the Cajuns, which are farming population, moved out of the area and were relocated down in Louisiana. But those that remained settled the territory of Quebec, which is now a province in Canada, and it's the second most populated province in Canada, and quite large. The rest of the territories, really sort of opened up as British interests moved westward, and between negotiations with the United States about where the boundaries of the U.S. were, as well as negotiations with Russia, Great Britain was able to sort of claim large sections of this country, primarily because it was unexplored. Large sections of, particularly the islands in the far northern section of Canada, were simply claimed by Britain but never really explored until the 20th century. This shows you a little bit about migratory patterns for here in the United States. You can see just primarily a westward expansion, with the exception of African Americans who, after the Civil War, after 1860, began to move out of the South into the more industrialized North, putting away farming as their principal background in picking up, factory jobs, industrial jobs. You see there's a map here that also talks about cultural movement. As I mentioned to you, Cajuns originated up here in Quebec, and it's kind of an interesting story you can certainly look up about how the Cajuns ended up down in Louisiana, which was, both of these were part of French territory. During the French and Indian War, Britain claimed or was able to take Quebec as part of the British Empire. The French still retained Louisiana Purchase and kept it until they sold the land to the United States in order to fund Napoleon's campaign across Europe. When we look at the wealth of this particular area, natural resources is really what's built both of these countries. The United States through mining and lumber originally, later on oil and gas. Canada, lumber has always been a major role, certainly mining in particular. Yukon territory, which is in the far northwest, sort of famous for its gold and silver deposits. But a big part of what's helped develop this region is an intense desire to develop transportation outlets in very aggressive ways. The United States more so than Canada. Of course, Canada utilizing their shipping lanes and in places like bays and so forth to create links inland. But the United States, once they had moved past, utilizing the Mississippi River, Ohio River, Missouri River, and so forth, began really aggressively developing railroads, particularly following the Civil War. It was a race to try to link different railroads that started from California and moved eastward, and all the rail lines on the East Coast, moving them into the central part of the United States. A big part of the development of this area has also been the rise in population. The population of the United States, particularly in the late 19th and early 20th century, grew dramatically, and that helped fuel more farming, basically transforming the United States into a farming industry, and then later on, that same population becoming a major part of how we sort of became the dominant industrial power in the early and mid 20th century. But also, the United States spent a lot of money on education, investments in technology, acquisitions of technology, which helped fuel the economy in ways that other places in the world have not experienced. Even Europe, which is incredibly industrialized. The Industrial Revolution, in fact, starts in Europe, but it's here in the United States that it really takes on a level that is unmatched in other places in the world. As you can see, the United States and Canada are in the upper tier of the per capita income. So, in other words, the individuals overall are more wealthy or have more purchasing power here in the United States than what we see in other parts of the world. And you can certainly see how in these diagrams how that then leads to the availability of technology, luxury goods, availability of water, clean running water, access to television. But on the flip side, that also means that the use of energy and the amount of pollution produced by these two nations is quite high relative to other places in the world. The United States is a major world player, both economically as well as militarily. The United States is considered to be the most powerful military in the world. We have Canada, has a thriving military as well, but certainly it's more of a defensive force as opposed to a force that is able to be deployed around the world the way the United States is. Both the United States and Canada are members of the United Nations. Of course, the United Nations has two headquarters, one in Geneva, the other one is in New York City. And both countries are part of the G8, which means they represent the largest economies in the world. And as a result of that, these large economies regularly meet to discuss policies and ways that they can certainly strengthen each other's economies, but also be responsible economic partners, financial supporters around the world and in more developing parts of the world. The G8 developed as an organization following the fall of the Soviet Union as a desire to try to be more responsive to the changes in global power. The fact that the Cold War was no longer creating a us versus them kind of mentality, Soviets versus the United States and its allies kind of mentality, and therefore what does that mean in terms of creating economic partnerships? Even in places like Russia. The United States and Canada are linked, along with Mexico, with a kind of a regional economy, very similar to the kind of regional economy that developed in Europe with the European Union. In here we call it NAFTA, the North American Free Trade Agreement. Unfortunately, since 9/11, in other words, since the planes crashing in the World Trade Center and the rise in terrorism, the breakdown in borders that we see or saw we see in Europe, unfortunately, does not translate over to North America. In other words, even though you have a lot more flexibility to move agricultural goods in particular in and out of the United States, Canada, and Mexico. There's fears that the border was too porous, and so there is still border checks, unlike in places like Europe where you can literally go from Belgium to France and back again without having to stop and have your car check or show your passport. The North American population, the United States is continually increasing, but that's largely to do with either a little bit of natural growth, but also continued immigration. In the United States, of course, big debate is that a lot of the immigration is illegal, mostly as a result of pretty much Congress and the White House not agreeing on what legal immigration should look like. You see patterns in both areas moving towards more urbanization. Both were very much rural nations. The United States was rural up until about World War II, majority rural population. Canada was majority rural population up until about the 1950s. And then you really see a growth in the density of urban areas, and particularly in places like the east coast of the United States. You can see here that, of course, the majority of the United States population, even Canada, majority of their population really is in this corridor between Detroit and Quebec City, is this majority of the population. But 80% of Canadians live within this narrow band all along the United States border. And then, of course, you have vast pockets of Canada that are just pretty much rural and underdeveloped. The United States, the majority of the population, of course, has always been in the eastern half of the United States, but certainly here along the Pacific coast, you have very large cities. LA, of course, is the second major metropolitan area. San Francisco is huge. Portland is huge. Seattle is huge. Portland is fairly good size as well. The biggest growth of the United States tends to be towards the south. In other words, people moving from the north down to the south, which attributes to why Phoenix, Las Vegas have grown in large, huge populations. Texas is constantly expanding. Even Oklahoma, has grown by 500,000 people in the last 20 years. But the biggest growth, the biggest concentration of people in the United States is this, what the book calls the megapolis, this corridor between Boston and Richmond, Virginia, which includes cities like Philadelphia and Baltimore and Washington, D.C., and Hartford, Connecticut, New York City, and so forth, and creating this huge urban sprawl that runs right down the East Coast. This gives you a little bit about the immigration pattern here in the United States. Pretty much constant growth. The only dips that you see are as a result of depressions or economic downturns in the United States, but the United States tends to always recover from these economic downturns. We've never seen a situation where either a depression or recession hasn't resulted in growth following. But you do see a dramatic drop-off in the immigration rate following World War II. Some of this has to do with Cold War. Some of this has to do with basically unchecked immigration in past centuries, requiring more regulation. And so this regulation has changed, but as a result, the United States has also not kept up with its immigration needs. And when I say immigration needs, there is a need for most every country in the world, particularly developed nations like the United States and Western Europe and Canada, to have a thriving immigrant population in order to fill workforce requirements, particularly because what we see in the United States is this kind of gives you a breakdown of the United States based on racial indications and in certain populations. You can see where certain populations tend to gravitate. Latino, Hispanic populations more out west, Asian populations more out west, but certainly more of this has to do with urbanized areas. But I wanted to pull up a map, see if I can find that map, and then I'll come back, where you see the United States. I'm not finding the map. That's probably very confusing. I'll go back here. But what you see in the United States is, like other parts of the world, is as the infant mortality rate decreases, populations tend to have less kids, and certainly in industrial countries you have better health care, and so people live longer. And so as a result, the indigenous population, indigenous meaning the people who have lived there for long periods of time, not just Native Americans, but people who have lived for generations, population growth tends to decline, and so then immigrant populations help fill the gap needed in certain workforces. And that's sort of what this flow kind of indicates a little bit. As I've said, well, this kind of talks more about population patterns, which I've kind of covered already. Canada has had its similar share of immigration growth as the United States. The difference is most of the immigrants in Canada tend to be Asian populations, whereas in the United States most of them are Latino. But of course, Asian populations have increased dramatically. It's important to understand that Canada is a bilingual country. French and English are considered to be the official languages there, whereas in the United States we actually don't have an official language, but it's common that of course everybody speaks English in the United States. Because of that divide in language, there's always been a divide in Canada between those that live in Quebec, the primarily French speakers, and the rest of the country who are English speakers. This we've already kind of covered. This gives you a little bit of basic distribution of major metropolitan areas around the United States. There is, of course, a lot of debate. You certainly hear it during election time between wealthier individuals and poorer individuals, as well as this idea that people are feeling more connected ever before because of technology, but also what technology tends to create, certainly communication technology, is niche groups. People tend to, using their technology resources, to gravitate towards people that are more like themselves. And so in that regard, you have a lot of connectivity, but you also have a lot of segregation based on ideals and values and so forth. Economic development. United States, as I said, started out as a farming-based economy, moved to manufacturing. We now are more service industry, more tech-based industry, and our economy thrives on those interconnections both globally as well as domestically. The United States has been heavily, what this talks a little bit about is uneven development. There has been a drive since the 1950s. It started with the Roosevelt administration in the 30s, but really since the 1950s there's been an effort to try to equalize development around the nation. That is to say that rural areas having access to electricity and clean water has been a priority, not just in urban areas but also in rural areas. This shows you a little bit about primary agricultural regions, which is what they call the Midwest. Although a lot of these agricultural distinctions do extend down here in Oklahoma. Oklahoma is a huge wheat producer. We produce quite a bit of corn and soybeans, but we are one of the largest wheat producers in not just in the nation but in the world. Certainly cotton production down here in the South. I should also say that also not represented here is the agricultural regions over here in California and in Oregon. You find certainly a lot of crop production, mass food production in California, year-round production, things like lettuce and so forth, are grown out west and then shipped around the United States. Urban landscape, of course, we live in what we term post-industrialized cities. That these are sort of a list of the major metropolitan areas around the United States. Oklahoma would sort of fit just below New Orleans here, with about 1.5 million people. But this kind of gives you an idea of the size of these different cities. And this kind of breaks down different regions of the United States. Oklahoma in particular fits into about 6 different regions. We occupy both the Great Plains, the Southeast, the South, the Midwest. There's a lot of sort of different aspects of the United States that sort of come to a crossroads here in Oklahoma. This gives you a map of those kinds of regions that they talked about. Like I said, this particular book focuses on Oklahoma as a Great Plains region, but very much in terms of its connection. Our strongest economic partner, Oklahoma's strongest economic partner, is the Dallas-Fort Worth area, and so we have more of a tie down through Texas than we do into the Midwest. But that said, the farming really relies on its connection to Chicago and the commodities exchange to help determine pricing and where things are getting shipped off to, because a lot of the food that's produced here in Oklahoma actually gets sent to other places in the world. When they talk about the megapolis, like I said, that's that kind of band of urban areas that extends from Boston all the way down to, they say Washington, D.C., but it actually really extends down here into Richmond, Virginia. And that kind of gives you a little bit of a closer view of it. Here's a province map of Canada. Northern Canada, just so you know, is not province. This is all territory. Yukon Territory. This is the Northwest Territory, and this is the Inuit Territories and islands. And so these are actually federal lands. I guess you could say it's something similar to Puerto Rico. It's basically what this territory is administered the same way that Oklahoma was before 1907, or the way Alaska was up into the 1950s. The voting population of Canada are all these provinces down here: the Great Plains provinces, the West Coast provinces, Ontario and Quebec, and then the Maritime provinces that are all over in here. Already covered most of this. Large, vast resources. Quebec, because of the French connection, has over time voted for independence in different times, and has lost by the narrowest of margins. So the possibility of a third country occupying the North American region is always a possibility. Quebec has a very strong trading relationship with the United States over and above the trading relationship between the United States and Canada. And so if Quebec did secede from Canada, it would not be that dramatic. It would be more of a kind of local, really more about local control over economies and making economic and social decisions about policies and so forth than it would about, in other words, it wouldn't be a dramatic split with military involved. It would be more of a subtle change. Canada, was a series of provinces that were administered by the British, but since the 1930s have been its own independent country, but it still has very strong ties to Great Britain. It still considers itself part of the British Commonwealth, which is kind of a trading bloc. And it considers Queen Elizabeth its monarch, and so she has appears on some of the money. This gives you a little bit of the land usage, which we kind of already looked at in a previous map, but you can also see how the area is interconnected with major rail systems. Canada does not have the vast interstate system. The United States is the most well-connected country in the world because of our interstate system. We also are well connected because we are one of the few countries that has multiple major ports along both the Atlantic Ocean, the Pacific Ocean. You don't find very many other countries other than like Canada, for example, where you have ports along both oceans. Mexico has a little bit of that, but again, not as economically developed as the United States and Canada. That's not as dramatically, those port systems aren't as elaborate. But certainly, rail systems are very important in Canada to move product around that particular series of provinces and territories. That is the end of this presentation. Certainly, if you have any questions, please let me know by calling or email me or text me. Thank you.